We need to have an uncomfortable conversation about World of Warcraft. We are halfway through the World Soul Saga. I know it's hard to think about, but we just had 12.1, the Curse of Ula'tek. We'll have one last major patch of Midnight, and then we'll have the last Titan. And this is as far as they've come. Quite frankly, it isn't good enough. And in today's video, I want to go over why. Hello everybody, it's your boy Jmulls, and it didn't have to be this way.
Our childhood home.
We are a few weeks away from BlizzCon, and at the last one, they announced the World Soul Saga. Something so big and monolithic that it would require 3 expansions all announced at the same time to properly tell this storyline. And at the halfway point, I have seen so many times people say this could have all been told in one expansion. I personally disagree. I think the issues with the World Soul Saga are multifaceted, kind of like the heads of a Hydra, where each individual head represents some other mess up they just can't seemingly get past. I think one of the biggest issues they have right now is planning. What do I mean by this? This has been the case with World of Warcraft for the longest time, but when you're focusing in on telling this trilogy of expansions for one singular story, this issue becomes all the more poignant. The focus of a patch's developmental cycle seemingly isn't to tell a story that flows from one patch into the next, it's to develop an aesthetic and a gameplay style that is unique to what came immediately before and what comes immediately after. I think this is grossly apparent with Midnight as an expansion. They crammed all the Elven and Eversong woods and all of the Sunwell stuff into the .0 series, and had it end with the creation of the Dawnwell. Had that all wrapped up in the time-gated quest series at the beginning of the expansion, so they could transition .1 into being troll-themed, to spice things up a little bit, to continue the Amani stuff from leveling. And by doing so, it makes the story itself of the World Soul Saga feel broken up and like we just engaged in one giant filler arc with maybe a few threads that might tie itself back into the A-plot. When you're trying to construct this overarching narrative, you want it to flow from one bit into the next. The World Soul Saga doesn't feel like that. And I've talked about religiously and repeatedly since the start of Midnight that more often than not, it feels like they're trying to tell plot points that work when you're trying to follow the storyline on like a breakdown or spark notes instead of telling a story that feels good in the moment. Because this issue also extends back to 11.1 with Undermined. Now, I liked Undermined as a patch, and while it did connect into the A-plot, most of what we were dealing there felt like filler, felt like a side story that we were engaging with that had a couple of moments that like tied back into the A-plot. I don't think that is good enough for the type of story they are trying to tell, and I think by doing so, it leads a lot of people to believe that this story could have been told in just one expansion. I think you could have done that, but I don't think it would have been told in an interesting way, without major revisions. I think what this story needs more than anything else is to slow down and allow these plot points to breathe, allow these characters to breathe and develop and feel natural, because they don't with this speed and pacing and this desire to have every patch feel and particularly look different to each other. World of Warcraft has never been a story-centric experience. It has always put the priority on the gameplay side of things. And I think for World of Warcraft, that is part of its identity, but that doesn't mean you have to be bad when it comes to telling a story that can be unique to World of Warcraft. This is abundantly clear, especially if you play World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, that Final Fantasy XIV and the way that that game tells a story is a major source of inspiration for the World Soul Saga. Obviously, they're not trying to copy it one for one, but it's a source of inspiration. And the reason that telling a story in Final Fantasy XIV works better is because they utilize each patch as a chapter in a grander narrative. It flows from one patch into the next, largely speaking. And by doing so, it allows Final Fantasy XIV to tell this grand narrative that feels like it has one chapter that flows seamlessly into the next. That is not the case for World of Warcraft. It breaks up the flow, it breaks up the pacing, and when they do focus on a plot, they have to cram it in at light speed in order to make it fit within just the parameters of that one content patch that allocating for that entire segment of story that feels in a lot of ways like it deserves multiple, especially with the number of characters that are in the cast of World of Warcraft and the World Soul Saga. When you have pacing like this, it doesn't do justice or service to any of them, or to any of the ideas and themes and messages you're trying to convey. And it really doesn't help when the story itself is bad at conveying those other elements. I talked about before how the issues with World of Warcraft storytelling and writing is like a hydra. Patch theme prioritization is only one head, there are many others.
Our childhood home.
Back in February, I made a video talking about the issues World of Warcraft has when it comes to writing, constructing, and developing male characters. The issues I talked about in that video have not been remedied, they have not been fixed. That is particularly true, and painfully so, when it comes to patch 12.1 Curse of Ula'tek, mainly with the character of Zul'Jan, a character that was a fan favorite for quite a few people in Midnight. There was just something about his character, the aura he brought to the table, that felt far more in line with the traditional elements of World of Warcraft that people have felt have been sorely lacking in modern WoW. So what did they do with this character? Did they introduce him and then also develop him in such a way to where he can be an interesting long-term character for World of Warcraft? Well, no, they used him as fodder for the character of Zul'Jara, just as a way to give her an emotional moment where she loses a member of her family, who then has to reaffirm right before he dies that her entire worldview was actually correct the entire time, and he was entirely in the wrong. And yeah, there's nothing wrong in a story, especially a long story like the Warcraft saga, with having tragic endings for certain characters. However, the problem isn't necessarily the execution. The execution wasn't good either, but it was the clear intention behind the execution of this character that I think has drawn the ire of so many. Because now it is abundantly apparent that the greatest fears people had with this character have come to pass. He existed solely to bolster the character of Zul'Jara, another interesting and male character that had a ton of potential to be an interesting element for the story going forward, thrown to the wayside, all to develop and be sacrificed to a female character. Now, the issues with this decision aren't readily apparent in a vacuum. However, as I covered in that other video, this continues a trend of World of Warcraft writing, where their continued default and what has become a trope for them is that they believe that the best way to develop a female character is at the expense of a male character. And I talked about this in my immediate impressions with 12.1, but I think this does a disservice to both characters. Because when it comes to the character of Zul'Jara and Zul'Jan, in my opinion, the best part of their characters was that sibling dynamic. But now that you have removed Zul'Jan from the equation to try to bolster the character and worldview of Zul'Jara and the message surrounding that character, I am now no longer interested in Zul'Jara as a character going forward, because you remove the element that made the both of them really interesting. This continued trend of taking an aggressive male character and turning them into a villain, all to prop up the worldview surrounding another female character, has become wildly tired and annoying.
Our childhood home.
The reason I called this video The Uncomfortable Truth with Modern WoW is because the conversation can be an uncomfortable one to have with the state of modern media and online discourse. Often these types of conversations become extremely vitriolic and polarized, divided upon ideological beliefs and which side of the culture war you fall on. There's obviously a bunch of people online that engage with discussing World of Warcraft that don't play the game, nor do they care about the game itself. They just want to attach whatever label to the game they can to give them some fuel for their online discussions. Let's acknowledge that exists and push it to the side for this point in time. I am someone who has played WoW on and off again for over half my life. I am too invested to not care somewhat about this game and where it goes, even through these stretches that greatly tire me. I also simply enjoy talking about the things that I both like and that I dislike, so WoW's kind of stuck with me. And when it comes to modern World of Warcraft writing, I think a big problem with a lot of it is a consequence of one of two possible scenarios. Scenario one is that the game feels written to engage in that culture war, where the primary drive for some writers, designers, etc. isn't to write the best possible story that fits and furthers the World of Warcraft in interesting ways that builds off what made most people fall in love with it to begin with, but is instead designed and written in such a way to look good online. And parts like how they write female characters, and also the way they are willing to sacrifice male characters, that story construction feels as if it's reinforcing their own position in the culture war. By prioritizing dragging WoW into that debate and stripping away and drastically watering down the awesome, aggressive, and cool elements that made WoW appeal to a lot of guys, not exclusively, But guys were obviously the target demographic, and further emphasizing the more cartoony and softer elements that always existed to some degree, but not to the degree they do nowadays, and they're not handled in the way they were back then. It drags WoW away from the balanced identity it used to have that appealed to a bunch of people, and now exists as a caricature of itself, so they can tell the execs and higher-ups that don't know much about anything that they are simply trying to appeal to a new, more quote-unquote modern audience to increase the player base and draw in a bunch of money. All the while, their own goal is to change and bastardize the world, story, and characters and move it away from what they believe is too male-centric as some kind of perverted conquest. The other scenario, and I genuinely don't know which is worse, is that they truly believe this is good writing. That by being as blunt as humanly possible about what they perceive to be a good message, that makes the story good and compelling. And that by being even more blunt and in your face about said message, that makes the story even better. And that these softer aesthetics and whatever characters, they're actually great. And this is how good stories are supposed to be written. I would personally argue that is not the case. And maybe they would too, to a degree. And maybe some of the execution issues we run into are because of the tight deadline of WoW patches being pumped out the door every couple of months. It could also more realistically be some combination of them thinking the story itself is really good and think it could be even better with a bit more time, that they simply aren't granted. I think the issues with WoW's writing come from both the ideas behind the story and the execution, so I don't think necessarily giving them more time remedies everything. Regardless if it's one scenario or the other, or some kind of mix of both, the quality of the end product suffers as a result of the ideas that go into it, what they prioritize for the story, how they write the story, and how they develop not only the world, but also characters. On top of that, how they choose to construct dialogue, how they pace their stories, how they select what constitutes a patch or not, how quickly they attempt to get these patches out the door. Like I talked about earlier in the video, the problems with World of Warcraft are like heads of a hydra. There's not just one thing, there's a lot of them.
Our childhood home.
And I talked about before about the issues of the cozy problem when it comes to World of Warcraft. The aesthetics that are actively chosen. The way that the game decides what look and visual that it wants to embrace on a moment-to-moment basis. When it comes to advertising, when it comes to marketing, when it comes to enemy design, like the Stinks in 12.1 looking overtly cute. When you had that one interview where Holly Longdale said Chris Metzen said at some point that they wish they had encoded Warcraft because it sounds intimidating. When you cultivate an audience of people that want a certain thing, and now you're no longer trying to provide that thing in the way that you once did, people will be upset by that. Especially when your story that you are telling sucks. If you don't want people to connect the dots, don't give them a bunch of dots and a pencil. The game and story feels far too soft, and every time an element of the world returns as the center focus of World of Warcraft, it feels like there's an active attempt to sand down all the grit and texture that once existed in this corner of Azeroth. In this case, when it comes to Midnight, that would be the Amani and also the Blood Elves. To sand down these once interesting elements of the world and story that were immersive and interesting, to resolve it all in a story that beats you over the head with its lack of subtlety, with a tone and vibe that feels like it's designed to appeal to like actual children. When you have all of these disparate elements coming together, that is going to produce negative sentiment. You pile on top of that a patch cadence which is far too quick, to where elements and gameplay elements feel far too rushed out the door. You have a swath of cutscenes at important points of the story that look like bad YouTube machinima from Cataclysm. You relegate all the emotional bits of characterization to just basic quest text, and focus the vast majority of your cutscenes on your bootleg attempted aura farming and action sequences, with bad planning for when it comes to constructing a patch, when you clearly don't give the developers and writers enough time for each patch by itself. Combined with all of these other issues, it makes modern World of Warcraft, when it comes to its story, when it comes to the way that it's developing the world of Azeroth, feel inorganic, off-putting, and an affront to everything that came before that made so many people fall in love with it all those years ago. And there's another uncomfortable truth that I want to talk about right now. I don't think any of this makes World of Warcraft beyond a point of no return. return. I think they could fix the story and the feeling of the World of Warcraft very quickly. It wouldn't take long, maybe a couple of patches. They would actually just have to put out the door good cinematics and good story and give themselves enough time for each patch to where they don't come out the door broken as hell. A lot of people like to write off stuff like modern World of Warcraft as if it's unsalvageable. To me, that is an excuse to allow World of Warcraft to continue doing what it has been doing. It doesn't need to change. There's no point in changing. It's already gone beyond a point of no return. It might as well just keep doing what it has been doing. I don't think it's ever too late to fix this game, and I don't think it's ever too late to fix the World of Warcraft and Azeroth overall. But it would require a fundamental change in design philosophy when it comes to writing, when it comes to how World of Warcraft constructs and develops characters. It's not a simple fix, and there's not just one thing that it would have to do. What I'm saying is, I don't think a good defense exists in modern World of Warcraft by saying it has to be this way, there's no point in trying something different. I view that to be weak. To continue to tell the story of World of Warcraft like this, to continue to develop the world and the characters, and to tell patches like this is an active choice that could be fixed somewhat quickly. I know this to be true because of Final Fantasy XIV. When it came to Dawntrail, I didn't like the vibe, I didn't like the tone, I didn't like the way that expansion told and constructed a story, and I didn't like the way that it developed characters. By the point 2 patch, all my issues have been remedied, and the next expansion is looking extremely interesting and compelling. There is no reason, in my opinion, that World of Warcraft cannot do the same. The biggest obstacles is if they think that what they are putting out the door is good enough. If this is actually a good story to them. I think one of the biggest pitfalls they come across is that they believe by simply having a good message or having a good theme and being as blunt about that as humanly possible, that makes the story good because the message is good. So by being even more blunt and obvious and bashing you over the head about the good message it has, that means the story is even better. I disagree with this idea fundamentally. I think World of Warcraft and Blizzard needs fundamental changes because the modern WoW story is a laughingstock.
Our childhood home.
So here's where you come in. Put a comment down below. What was your favorite element of the World of Warcraft story, or what was your favorite moment or character? I was always partial to that one scene of Garrosh Hellscream at the end of Stone Talon Mountains in Cataclysm. That entire sequence was just bliss. And while you're down there, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And you best believe I played 12.1, and if you want my reaction to the events of that story and my immediate impressions after playing it, you should check out this video right here for more. Thank you all for tuning in. Stay safe. Have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.